Will Russia actually turn to nuclear weapons? It was the 21st of February, only one day into the invasion of Ukraine, when Russian President Vladimir Putin was seen in a televised speech alluding to the possibility of Russia using nuclear weapons. More specifically, it seemed like he was threatening to direct them at NATO. Russia will respond immediately. The consequences will be such as you have never seen in your entire history. Initially, the threat was met with confusion as much as fear. Surely he's not actually alluding to using nukes, right? Especially when it's not even a case of self-defense. Most nuclear powers have come to accept that the point of these weapons is to be used as a last resort in cases of defense. But surely no one would be serious about using them when they were being the aggressor. Let me get this straight. Putin first invades Ukraine unprovoked, then threatens NATO if they do anything to directly support Ukraine, then nukes will be involved. Who does Putin think he is? Like some hot female Twitch streamer or something? Thinking she can get away with breaking the terms of service of the website that everyone else has to strictly obey, except for her because she's special. Just a few days later, the confusion became a more concrete threat when Putin ordered the Russian military to transfer nuclear forces to a special mode of combat duty. In the protocols of launching nuclear weapons from Russia, this is an important step. Dramatic would be an understatement. These weapons are normally kept in far less aggressive modes for good reason. It means there's more of a buffer zone if Putin decides, in a moment of madness, that could otherwise turn the whole world into a nuclear wasteland. Most reports from Russian nuclear weapons experts say that the launch orders can't be transmitted even by the command and control system during peacetime. Changing the mode of the nuclear forces to combat duty means they're actually ready to fire if someone with the right authority gives the launch order. Whilst Putin's words were obviously a threat, he played it off as a defensive response, as if NATO totally put a gun to his head and forced him to invade Ukraine or something. Unless you have the IQ of a toilet bowl, otherwise known as a Russian supporter, you could easily see through this BS. Once reports started to come out, it looked increasingly likely that the Kremlin might genuinely use nukes as a first strike surprise attack. Preemptive missile strikes are one thing, but preemptive nukes are a whole different board game that no country in the world has ever considered approaching before. The Kremlin story that it was a necessary response to sanctions placed on Russia after the invasion began, even though Russia claims daily that those sanctions totally don't work. So please lift the sanctions or we're going to go nuclear? I mean, is there a better way to tell me the sanctions are working without actually telling me the sanctions are working? For better or for worse, that deranged threat seemed to slip to the back of many people's minds as the war grinded on over the spring and summer. People stopped talking about the apocalypse and discussing an ongoing war of attrition, which is still terrible enough for the people in Ukraine. But things ramped up again in September, big time. On the 21st of that month, dictator Putin decided, "Yup, I'm totally winning here in Ukraine, and because we're winning so much, Russia needs to go into partial mobilization of troops." That meant 300,000 male reservists will be summoned by force for action, mainly with the aim of securing the territories, holding referendums in eastern Ukraine held as a precursor to official annexation. These annexations completely change how we think about the threat of Russia using nuclear weapons. The doctrine used to be that they were the last resort that would be turned to only if the state itself was under existential threat. Throughout the war, though, the rhetoric has slowly changed so that nukes are now supposedly fair game if any of Russia's perceived territorial integrity is under threat, even if they just outright stole the land. What does territorial integrity mean, though? To most sane people, it doesn't include literally stealing someone else's and taking it by force. However, that's because most people do not have the IQ on the same level as a Russian supporter. To them, stealing other people's stuff is perfectly okay, and when the original owner of the stolen property for some strange reason wants their property back because you literally stole it from them, then Russia's territorial integrity is magically compromised. But seriously, what does the Kremlin expect international order to look like from now on? Does Putin seriously think just by making a few people vote for you at gunpoint on the land that you stole, then magically that land you just stole then legitimately becomes yours and you can nuke anyone who disputes it? Unfortunately, that seems to be the low IQ reasoning that Putin and his supporters are advocating. That seems to be the thinly veiled threat that Putin is relaying, in which case Russia turning to nuclear weapons becomes an actual plausible possibility, because obviously the rest of the world will not agree to this. This tactic of mixed messaging that Russia seems to have latched onto since the invasion began is ripe for disaster. A land war in Europe was already a dangerous enough prospect before the endless possibilities for misinterpretation and false assumptions arose. There's a long history of close calls when it comes to nuclear weapons, most famously with the Cuban Missile Crisis. It really doesn't take much in the margin of human error for 90% of humanity to be just a few hours away from total annihilation. That's why the sensible thing is always to be clear about nuclear warfare, which is what Russia was partially aiming for with its original doctrine of only using nukes as a last resort if the state is under existential threat. By muddying this doctrine to support Putin's land grab, the Kremlin has started to create a fuzzy gray area in an area where there really shouldn't be one. When it comes to doomsday explosions, transparency is a damn crucial starting point. The idea of MAD, mutually assured destruction, used to play a large part in staving anyone off from actually considering pressing the nuclear launch button. The basic premises was that once one nuke is fired, another 1,000 is then inevitably fired back, and the whole world ends up in such a state of destruction and horror that any thought of pressing the nuclear button would never enter the mind of a rational human being. Since the end of the Cold War, though, the idea of mutually assured destruction has gradually been undermined. In the modern age of cyber attacks and the ability for foreign states to interfere with one another's states' ability to control their most important weapons, destruction is no longer mutually assured. This gives mad dictators like Putin the confidence that they might be able to fire a nuke without one necessarily being fired back. Russia is famous for their cyber attack capabilities, after all. If they could confidently shut down NATO countries' abilities to launch their own nukes, even if only for a short amount of time, then it becomes a lot more viable for the Kremlin to press the launch button first. But the chances of Putin being able to disable all opposing nuclear devices that the West has simultaneously at the same time is basically as good as him making a full-time living by selling nudes on OnlyFans. In other words, it's not going to happen. Even if America is seen as Russia's main enemy, that's not to say Moscow wouldn't come under nuclear fire from other Western allies if they were ever to do something as mad as fire first. There are 5 main countries with nuclear capability: Russia, the USA, China, the UK, and France. The NPT, signed by most of the world, basically says it's okay for these countries to hold on to these weapons for now. Then, India, Pakistan, and North Korea also openly claim to have their own supplies, although none are likely to turn enthusiastically against Moscow for Washington's sake. Israel, who are far more likely to follow NATO's calls, are also widely assumed to be nuclear armed. This mix of countries, some consider rogue, makes the potential nuclear battlefield an unprecedented melting pot. And things weren't helped when the INF, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, fell apart in 2019 after the USA walked out. This was in place to help the world regulate how many ground-launched nuclear missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers were deployed by countries at any one time. In the crazy modern world, pacts such as that one and the new START, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty Agreement, are impressive bits of diplomacy, but when they start to crumble, as they have at times over recent years, the doomsday clock moves ever closer to midnight. So, with the collapse of the INF Treaty, an unknown amount of short-range nuclear weapons have been withdrawn and put in storage without any legal restraints. That means no one can be sure how close Russia's arsenal is to the point of being ready to fire. The NPT Review Conference is another diplomatic opportunity often used to reduce these nuclear tensions. Surprisingly, discussions at the event are even fruitful at times. However, the sessions held in New York in August 2022 was nothing short of a disaster. The usual aims were there of encouraging non-proliferation nuclear disarmament and highlighting the importance of using nuclear energy for good instead. Initially, it even looked like things were going well, and a rare glimmer of light may slip out. But on the last day, Russia withdrew its agreement, undermining essentially all progress from the event. Their lack of willingness to engage in such important steps at a time of such crazy global tension should put everyone on high alert of just how willing Russia might be to revert to nuclear attacks. But how that would play out would mainly depend on which country Russia aimed its weapons at. NATO, by far the strongest military force in the world, includes the famous Clause 5, which essentially states that if one member is attacked, all members will declare war on the aggressor. As huge as Russia is, and as powerful as its military is, or at least was supposed to be before the war, there isn't a chance in hell it could ever deal with NATO's full military and nuclear capability. No matter how sophisticated its cyber attack technology is, or how many of its nuclear warheads have remained hidden, it just doesn't have the resources to match the entirety of NATO, which includes military giants such as the USA, France, and the UK. And that's assuming that every single one of Russia's nuclear warheads work 100% and are maintained perfectly. Now, judging from the pathetically piss-poor state of Russian maintenance of their equipment used in Ukraine, it's a high likelihood that a large portion of their nuclear arsenal doesn't actually work as intended. Now, if Putin is crazy enough to actually use nukes, a possible scenario would be that Russia uses targeted tactical nuclear warheads inside annexed Ukrainian territory. Unfortunately for Ukraine, they were talked into giving up all of their nukes when the Soviet Union fell. A decision they definitely regret now, and wouldn't have any large way of retaliating if they were hit. The only thing that they'd possibly have to fall back on would be to call for NATO's help. But NATO knows the global devastation they'd be risking if one nuclear power were to fire at another. That's what makes the limited use of nuclear weapons inside annexed territory in Ukraine look like an actual plausible possibility. And however worrying it is, there's only so much the rest of the world can do. As Russia starts officially declaring parts of Ukraine that they stole to be fully annexed, they could ramp up the rhetoric of using nukes against anyone who violates their territorial integrity. This will force Ukraine to choose between just openly giving up on their stolen land, at which point Russia is just encouraged to continue annexing, asking NATO for help, who are unlikely to want to get sucked into nuclear annihilation, or continue fighting alone and run the possible risk of Russia deploying nuclear weapons. We can't know for sure how serious the Kremlin is with its convoluted but terrifying threat. If it's not bluffing, then its strategy could unfortunately be very efficient, backing Ukraine into a corner with no way out. It might require NATO to match the hyped-up rhetoric for Russia to back down, but if either side were to ever match their words with actions, then we'd see destruction unlike anything the planet has ever witnessed before. Since their invention, nuclear weapons have been surprisingly restrained tools, aside from when the US dropped 2 nukes on Japan near the end of World War II. In the modern world, though, the theory of mutually assured destruction may be defunct. With the way things are going now, the future could seem a whole lot safer if we were to eradicate them forever to give countries like Ukraine a better chance of survival.